Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Fighting wildfires means all hands on deck for BC communities like Fort Nelson. We're asking you, what resources does your community need to prepare for wildfires? In about half an hour, Alice Munro, the celebrated short story writer, has died at 92. We'll take you to Munro's books in Victoria, where they've been flooded with calls today, and asking you, what has Alice Munro's writing meant to you? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on the CBC News app, also on cbc.ca/BC, as well as on YouTube. You can look for CBC Vancouver. And you can call us now on our top story. What resources does your community need to prepare for wildfires? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, and you can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. Well, wildfires are already forcing people to flee some BC communities. As you know, more than 4,000 people have evacuated from Fort Nelson due to the nearby Parker Lake wildfire. And today, conditions remain stable. That fire remains about 2.5 kilometers away. Meanwhile, further south, another wildfire has caused the evacuation of the Doig River First Nation, which is close to Fort St. John. Incidentally, of course, Fort St. John is where most Fort Nelson evacuees have gone. Over the last few days, we've been hearing from the CBC's Yvette Brent. She's there in Fort St. John, and here she's with the latest.
Well, overnight, the winds did die down. It was a little bit calmer. There's about 50 people that are still staying up in Fort Nelson, and you can see them overnight checking the water lines. There's these massive tanks of water where they have hoses running off them, to try to keep that ground wet in case that fire jumps the river again and gets closer to town. Everyone is concerned because it's so dry, and they're watching that wind today. It did die down overnight, but as you can see, it's starting to pick up again here in Fort St. John, and it is supposed to get to 20 kilometers per hour later this afternoon or into the evening in Fort Nelson. So that will be top of everybody's mind there, especially if it shifts and blows toward the town.
Now, one of those people who had to leave Fort Nelson is Rena Moore. Here she is describing what happened as she departed.
When I went to the hotel in the morning to say goodbye to my husband, there was another lady, and she was just sitting there, and I looked at her and I said, "Are you leaving?" And she went, "I don't know. I only found out about it this morning." So I said, "Go get in my truck." We didn't know each other, had no idea who she was. "Go get in my truck." And she did. And so I said to her on the way down, "I told you to get in my truck. I didn't even ask you if you wanted to leave or stay." And she says, "No, I wanted to leave." And I said, "Okay, I'm just glad you didn't think I was crazy." So we made it all the way. It was good for both of us because I had someone in my truck that I could talk to. We arrived in Fort St. John, and I knew shortly before I got here that my bonus family, Autumn and Dakota Mercer, had arranged for their neighbor's fifth wheel to be brought up for me to use, which I haven't even met him, and I'm so entirely grateful for. Reunited with my grandchildren at Autumn and Dakota's before I went all the way into town, because I'm about 10-15 minutes out of town. And then I went into town and started to pre-register and was overwhelmed by the hugs from community members. It was absolutely amazing.
That's evacuee Rena Moore speaking to CBC from just outside Fort St. John. As you heard, she was grateful for the welcome, but as more regions face the potential for wildfire or for hosting evacuated residents, we're asking you, what resources does your community need to prepare for wildfires? Our numbers are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690. You can email to bctoday@cbc.ca. I have two guests joining me. Robin Cox is a professor in disaster management and response at Royal Roads University. And James Whitehead is an engagement analyst with the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative that's at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. He's also a former wildland firefighter. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon, Michelle.
Good afternoon, Michelle.
Thanks so much for joining us. Robin, to you first. I'll ask you, what resources do communities need to prepare for wildfire?
I think one of the first resources they need is to, anticipate, to shift a mindset and really anticipate that these wildfires are going to increase in frequency and severity. So planning forward both for evacuation, but for housing evacuees. And we know that housing is a critical issue without dealing with evacuees. So really thinking long and hard about how a community can host evacuees.
And James, what about you? Is it about that forethought and planning?
Take a little bit I fully agree with that, and I'd take a little bit of a different angle as well, and just in engagement and recognition that we do live in a fire-prone ecosystem, and a fire in many areas is a matter of when, not if. So just looking at that, recognizing employment properties are at risk, and engaging people in preparation well in advance of fire season. When we get the order to go, that's not the time to start preparing. The time to prepare is long before that.
So have we learned our lesson then? Has BC improved in that planning and knowing that this is going to happen over the course of the last few years, James?
There has been a huge improvement. Conversations around wildfire are far, far ahead of where they were 5 or 10 years ago. And many, many residents and rural communities are very aware of the fire risk that they face. However, there's still a challenge, I think, in getting people to actually recognize it could be me, and I'm getting people to take those steps to prepare their homes. And so we've seen a lot of investment in marketing on things like Fire Smart and the new BC Wildfire app. And in that, they're also including evacuation planning and preparedness, so things like checklists and options as to where to go. So in terms of improvement, there's been a ton, and there's definitely still improvements to be made as well.
Robin, when we think of wildfires and communities affected, we often think of course, rural communities, right? What about further into urban areas? James just said, people don't think it's going to be me, but should we just, keep that in mind wherever we are?
Absolutely, and even more especially here on the island, where a lot of the land that surrounds communities is private forested land, and there are specific issues related to forest management and how municipalities and regional districts can work with private landowners. They can't force them to do anything. So this issue of fire smart and dealing with excess fuels on the ground and such needs to be incorporated into the planning, which has some logistical and jurisdictional challenges. And we are vulnerable to their new term is the forested front line. Many communities are on the forested front line, and we need to be changing our thinking to start including that as a threat that we all have to deal with and we all have to plan for.
Yeah, you talk about Vancouver Island. We actually have a caller from Port Alberni right now. My guests, Robin Cox, professor and program head in the MA program, the Climate Action Leadership Program, and the former program called Disaster and Emergency Management, and that's at Royal Roads University. And we're also joined by James Whitehead, who is a former wildland firefighter. I'd love to ask you about that and what might be going on in the ground, on the ground in Fort Nelson right now, as well. Now, an engagement analyst with the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative. That's at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. And joining us now, again, we're asking you, what are the resources your community needs to prepare for wildfire season? Our numbers are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. And Roman is calling us from Port Alberni. Hi, Roman, welcome back.
Good afternoon, thank you.
We talked last year, I remember, when that when the highway was closed down because of wildfire, and there was the one road, right, leading to Port Alberni. So is that what you're thinking of right now?
Well, I was going to use both of your pundits' key points that they're making about preparedness, knowing where your escape routes are, and being strategic in the approach so that we're not bottlenecking on the way in or out. And I want to add to that confirmation from our valley, from our city, which also extends out to the west coast, Yakulit, Tofino, and quite a large number of First Nations communities throughout that are all going to be highly impacted. And I know this will be an audacious goal, big, hairy, audacious goal, but we need secondary access in and out of this valley. And being that as such an audacious goal, I think it would be wise to also, in terms of strategic planning, work towards that goal with great contingency planning in place until such a goal can be achieved.
Roman, thank you so much for the call. This was, the prolonged closure of Highway 4 on Vancouver Island. And again, the only highway leading to those communities on the west side of the island, Port Alberni, Tofino, Ucluelet, because of wildfire. And, I think about Fort Nelson and the slow-moving bumper-to-bumper traffic coming out of Fort Nelson along Highway 97. When you have those kind of one road in, one road out, Robin, what are the other options? Should we be looking at, well, in the case of the island, using boats or alternative modes of transportation?
Yeah, I think that, I know that there are some considerations already in sort of multiple modes of transport for evacuation, including air and water. And I think that absolutely as individuals and communities and provincial governments, we need to be thinking about those alternatives. We know that in the context of climate change, these events are increasing. They're increasing in size and affecting more communities. And so we need to think about adapting to and being very flexible in our response. And that requires resources, as your caller indicated, but also thinking through during the non-fire season, although we're sort of moving towards what California has as a year-long fire season, thinking forwards individually and collectively about how we not only plan for fires, adopting Fire Smart, which was mentioned before, making sure that our homes are as fire smart and the lands around us are as fire smart, but also anticipating the need for evacuations and how we will do that using multiple modes of transportation and multiple modes of communication, because we also know a huge issue with evacuation is the communication of information so that people can make decisions based on what is happening in a rapidly changing situation.
That's absolutely true. In the case of Fort Nelson, we're hearing residents are communicating either by radio to each other, but also really clamoring for that information on what's happening back home. And so using things like the security cameras at their homes, that they've set up to find out what exactly is happening in terms of structures there. I'm going to go to James in just a moment here, but let's go to Robert first, calling from Revelstoke, because you want to talk about the efforts made to fight fires. Is that Robert? Is that right, Robert?
Yes, hello. I was supporting the idea of water bombers. Looking around Revelstoke, we had some fires here the last couple of years ago that came pretty close to town. There was helicopters, there was bombers here. We were lucky that they were here. If they weren't here, that fire would have kept on going. We lost Lytton. We may lose northeastern BC. There's just a lack of water bombers. For the price of a water bomber, I think Revelstoke could almost have 2 bombers. Golden could have 2 bombers. Kamloops could have a couple of bombers. If there's a big fire, these bombers can get together. We'd have a fleet. Right now we are just in dire need of bombers, I believe.
Robert, thank you very much for the call. I'll go to you, James. Yesterday the BC Wildfire Service held an update on the Parker Lake fire near Fort Nelson, as well as the emergency management minister. And they said all the local effort right now is defending the town against the fire, ensuring it doesn't hit Fort Nelson and destroy structures. So what does an operation like that look like right now?
Yeah, it's a very complex operation, and especially when you are involved with a municipality or a community, it's known as Unified Command, where you'll have the wildfire service running part of the fire and the local fire department or Office of Fire Commissioner running the municipal part of the fire, and those two groups need to work together along with other municipal or regional agencies. So it gets quite jurisdictionally complex, and there's so many moving parts. So often you might hear that there's 70 firefighters on the ground or 100 firefighters on the ground, but you also have to consider overhead personnel, equipment operators, camp staff. And so you might be looking at 1.5 to 2 times the number of people. And it's a very dynamic situation. The other thing to consider as well is the people that are making those decisions about who goes where and who does what are also having to deal with the fact there may be unexpected fire starts elsewhere, or other communities threatened, or sudden changes where in a vacuum one plan makes sense, but you also need to prepare for that contingency. So it's just a very complex, dynamic situation where it's in some ways more of an art than a science as to how to strategize and how to work in these situations and coordinate everyone in a cohesive way.
Okay. And to Robert's point about water bombers, can you tell us more about the role that they do play? As I understand it, it's not to try and put out fires, but it's to alleviate the dry brush that's around them to prevent the spread. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's two types of water bombing that is really used in BC, or bombing that's really used. One is water, and we often use small light skimmer planes for that. That are known as amphibious, so they basically float planes that can suck up water. And then we also use retardant for some of the larger aircraft. And it has slightly different purpose. Retardant is the red stuff you might see on videos or on the news around fires. And basically retardant will prevent the fire from spreading, or at least slow its spread for roughly 4 hours. And that's used to buy crews a little bit more time and to stop the spread. But if it's a really intense fire, it's not very effective. Water bombers, on the other hand, are very good at protecting certain values, and they can cycle very fast, especially our modern fleets in BC. But once again, water from the air can typically subdue a fire and knock it down a little bit if it's not too intense. But it makes very little long-term difference unless you actually have someone there on the ground to come and put those spots out. So once you get to an area that's previously been bombed, you'll see a smoldering ground fire, and then you still need crews there to literally go and be on their hands and knees digging up dirt and putting those small little smokes out, which given a couple hours can start up again.
My guests here are joining me right now to talk about community resources that are needed to prepare for wildfire season. And Robin Cox is a professor and program head of the MA in Climate Action Leadership at Royal Roads University. And James Whitehead is an engagement analyst specializing in engaging on wildfire initiative mitigation initiatives with the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, also a former wildland firefighter, asking you what are the resources that your community needs to be able to prepare for wildfire season. We heard a lot yesterday from the mayor of Fort Nelson, the regional district there, as well as Dan Davies, who's the BC United MLA for North Peace River. And, he was talking about speaking with the minister about needing more resources. So what are those resources that your community needs? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. We got this email yesterday. Before I go to our next call here, Scott wrote us from the Sunshine Coast. I'd like to put this to Robin because this is about evacuations and more vulnerable populations. And Scott wrote, one of the key issues I'm deeply concerned about is the need for more awareness for congregate accommodations with evacuations. Have you ever considered the potential challenges of evacuating the Sunshine Coast in an emergency? It's a question that's been on my mind, and I believe it's one that we as a community need to address. When it comes to those congregate homes, long-term care homes, we know about a hospital in the Fort Nelson area, for example. But when it comes to those homes, what are the plans that they need to have in place, Robin?
Well, again, one of the fundamental messages is the plans have to be comprehensive and they have to be done well in advance of needing them, because there are a lot of complexities about logistically about evacuating people with different abilities. And it's not just those homes, but people also living in the community with disabilities that may limit their access to mobility, to vehicles, etc., or who rely on medical equipment that has certain requirements. So the planning for that needs to happen in ways that include those people in the planning so that their voices are heard, either directly or through people that support and advocate for them. We've already talked about things like one road out, one road in, and that becomes complicated. We know, for example, in the California wildfires or recent wildfires in 2018, it took hours, 3 hours to get out, and Fort McMurray hours. So we know that we need to, in this sort of newer fire context, we need to be thinking in advance and evacuating people likely before they need to be evacuated, because trying to get everybody out at the same time is very difficult, even if you have multiple roads. If you only have one road, and sometimes that might be a dirt road, it's incredibly challenging. So thinking in advance and fundamentally building awareness and capacity so that everyone sees themselves as part of the plan, knows what the plan is for them individually and collectively, and as one of your callers indicated, is there to help other more vulnerable people in the community, and knows how they're going to do that, has talked to that person or those individuals, and is in effect already prepared to do that kind of thing, because it really does take a whole of community in order to manage a safe evacuation.
Oh, so like a staggered evacuation, perhaps?
Staggered, early warning, other things that we've discussed, like multiple modes.
Right.
So, mass transit things in urban centers. We've seen that in evacuations as well, where, the bus service needs to be called in to do that. You also need bus drivers in order to do that. So these kinds of things need to be planned for in advance, and they also need to be practiced, because in the moment,
Yeah.
there's a lot going on, as we've just
Absolutely.
heard. It's a very complex, volatile situation.
I know that in Whistler, they were holding some practice sessions a little while ago as well. Robin Cox is a program head of the MA in Climate Action Leadership at Royal Roads University. James Whitehead, engagement analyst with the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. It's 12:27 right now. And so again, to recap the wildfire situation in BC, that Parker Lake wildfire that caused the evacuation of Fort Nelson and the Fort Nelson First Nation remains at about 2.5 kilometers away from town. Right now, calmer weather conditions are helping the crews as they try to stave off the blaze. Meanwhile, yesterday, an evacuation order was issued for the Doig River First Nation Reserve, also in the Northeast. Officials say there is no immediate threat to structures in the area, and the Wildfire Service supports the Doig River First Nation's decision to issue evacuation orders. Late last night, the Peace River Regional District also issued evacuation orders related to that same fire. And over in the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, there is an evacuation alert for the Truax Creek area on the south side of Carpenter Lake, and that is due to a wildfire. Some information for you. Evacuees can register at ess.gov.bc.ca. The mental health support line, meanwhile, for evacuees is 310-6789. And you can check evacuation orders and alerts on Emergency Info BC on their site. And as for fire bans in BC, as we get into wildfire season, the Coastal Fire Center will ban Category 2 and 3 open fires as of noon this Friday. And fireworks and lanterns are also prohibited. But campfires up to 0.5 meter high or wide, as well as cooking stoves that use gas, propane, or briquettes are not banned. We heard from Emergency Management Minister Bowen Ma yesterday, though, urging people to remain cautious and vigilant due to those dry conditions around the province. You can head to the BC government website for a list of fire bans and restrictions. And as always, cbc.ca/BC or cbc.ca/lite, LITE. More of your calls now on preparing communities for wildfire. And Shane is on the line in Maple Ridge. Hi, Shane.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank your guests for an excellent conversation. I'm curious why the BC government, or the powers that be, don't close the Forest Service roads and gate them like robust gates, because if anyone goes in the backcountry, regardless of the time of year, starting in the spring, actually, I should say, into summer, it's crazy up there. So fire bans mean nothing to a lot of people. The dumping of garbage is another issue. But I'm just curious why they don't close these roads.
Right. Thank you very much, Shane, for the call. And we do know that according to Emergency Management BC Minister Bowen Ma saying yesterday that earlier in the season, you are going to expect more of the fires to be quote, human caused, but that can mean anything that is not lightning caused. And so when it comes to the Fort Nelson fire, officials say that it was caused by a tree falling. So anything that's not lightning is considered human caused or categorized as human caused. But Robin, are there ways to kind of, moderate human behavior more in order to prevent more of these human caused fires?
Well, I think it's a balancing act, right? We live in a province that celebrates the fact that we have a lot of wild land and natural environments to explore and to recreate in. And so, closing those off has its own consequences, both economically and psychologically and emotionally. And it's very difficult to police. And we also know that having people out in the forest can pose a danger, but it also can help with early warning and detecting of things like wildfire. So there's a real balancing act. And some of this, there are always, I presume, going to be people who unfortunately do things like dump garbage and are not responsible with wildfires. I would imagine, and I believe that most people are responsible, and the greater the awareness around what people can do to keep our land safe, to ensure that we have resilient lands in BC and elsewhere, I think is a more realistic approach. It's very difficult to police, even during a wildfire event, to stop people from taking back roads into communities and areas. We know that happens all the time in wildfires in rural and remote areas where people know how to get in. But it's also, we don't want to exclude people from being out in those lands, and ideally through that, not only recreating, but growing to value the land and coming into relationship with the land in ways that certainly Indigenous people have been honoring for millennia, which is a much more positive and healthy relationship with the lands on which we reside.
Let's take one last call here. Monica in Vancouver. Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up, is there any possibility that private planes or private companies that run planes in and out of places like Seashell Bay or smaller communities can be kind of like brought on board and somehow, Jimmy, so that they can help with the water bombing? Like, it feels like I watched a fire in Seashell back in 2017 that got way out of hand, and we just watched it get bigger and bigger, and there was planes coming in and out of the bay constantly. So, and all they had was one little helicopter, and I mean, the fire was tiny. It started from humans shooting guns, and it could have been put out, but it was not, and it turned into 400 hectares and blacked out our whole the whole lower mainland. So I'm just curious if that's something that could be done.
Monica, thank you so much, and thanks for that reminder in Seashells. James, what about using private aircraft?
Yeah, it's a good idea. The challenge is it requires still quite substantial infrastructure and quite substantial modifications on an aircraft to be able to carry water and liquids internally, and also to be able to drop that or deploy it effectively. So helicopters are very easy because we can simply attach a bucket onto the bottom of a normal helicopter. But when we talk about modifying fixed wing planes, it's a pretty fundamental rebuilding or redesign of how they operate. So it's quite difficult to use standard aircraft for that. So yeah, unfortunately, that's not something that's actively done at the moment.
It's not quite as easy as it may seem. Thank you so much to both of you. And unfortunately, I imagine we'll be speaking again as we head into this season. Really appreciate your expertise this afternoon.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Robin Cox is the program head of the MA in Climate Action Leadership at Royal Roads University. James Whitehead, engagement analyst with the Mitigating Wildfire Initiative at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. It's 12:35, 1:35 in the Mountain Time Zone. And coming up in our next half hour, we're going to talk about Alice Munro. Right now it's time for a CBC News update.
Good afternoon. As we've been hearing on the show, thousands of people remain out of their homes in northeastern BC because of the threat from wildfires. Most people have left the community of Fort Nelson. The Parker Lake blaze has grown to an estimated 84 square kilometers. And another fire in the area is causing concern. More than 100 members of the Doig River First Nation and people living nearby in the Peace region have been ordered out of their homes. Officials say the fire was moving away from the First Nations reserve last night, but there is the chance for winds to change directions. And Canadian Nobel laureate Alice Munro, one of the world's most honored writers of short stories, has died at the age of 92. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013. She had been in poor health in recent years. She spent much of her life in BC, but spent her final years in Ontario, where she was born. She died Monday at home in Port Hope. And now the forecast on the north coast. Rain this afternoon with a high of 10, highs to 17 and mainly cloudy in the Peace. In the central interior, a chance of showers with a high of 16, highs in the low 20s with lots of sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, mainly sunny with a high of 23. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley, lots of sunshine this afternoon with a high of 21 inland. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
I'm guessing your plans for tonight at 6:30 include Game 4.
Well, I was going to read my final headlines here at work, Michelle, but yes, after that, for sure, Game 4.
Sure.
We're excited.
Yeah, no, exactly. Work first, Rob.
Work first.
But yes, we're excited for that, and I'm sure you're going to head out. And again, Rogers Arena, people can go watch, I guess, and other places in town. That's what I like, is the community feel, right?
For
Everybody
sure,
getting
yeah.
together.
That's great.
So,
yeah, it's a good vibe.
It is a good, it's a great vibe, especially when it's 2-1.
Mm-hmm. And 3-1 after tonight. Yeah.
Yes, there you go. Thank you so much, Rob.
Sure.
Fingers crossed. I like how you think. Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. And we'll find out more as well on what's coming up on the coast.
Hi there, Michelle. It's Gloria Makarenko here, and I hope you can join us for On the Coast this afternoon. We'll talk about an advice show that warns you not to take their advice. It's called My Brother, and Me. It's a weekly comedy advice podcast, and the oldest brother is Justin McElroy. No, not that Justin McElroy. He's in town, and he's going to join us in studio. Also, the Canucks are going to face the Oilers in Game 4 today. The team ends up selling out Rogers Arena for the away games, but the biggest party in Metro Vancouver just might be the after-game celebration at 72nd and Scott Road along that Surrey-Delta border. We'll talk more about that party this afternoon for On the Coast between 3 and 6. That is quite the party. I've seen the footage. It's lit, as the kids say. Am I allowed to say that? Probably not. Thanks, Gloria. That's coming up at 3 o'clock in Metro Vancouver. Well, big news in Canadian literary and cultural landscape today. Alice Munro, one of Canada's most acclaimed and treasured authors, has died at 92. She was celebrated around the world for her rich, textured short stories, often about rural life. In 2013, she announced she was retiring from writing, and that same year, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Munro was 92. CBC's Deanna Sumanek-Johnson has more on her life and accomplishments.
Someone, the person crying out, kill me now.
She wrote about the wonders and disasters in the lives of everyday people, but Alice Munro's short stories were anything but ordinary.
But I don't write about, secret agents? Or people who have psychic experiences or something like this. But I never consider these people ordinary.
Alice Munro was born in Wingham, Ontario, the kind of small town where many of her stories took place. She married her first husband, Jim Munro, at 20 and soon became a mother of 3 children.
I just had very, very short times when I could write because I had little kids and no help. And so I couldn't possibly see a year ahead of me when I could write a novel. So I decided, well, learning how to write a novel, I'll write a few short stories.
Munro's life also provided inspiration for the content of her stories.
Of course, it's my mother I'm thinking of. My mother, as she was in those dreams, saying, "It's nothing, just this little tremor."
She lost her mother at a young age. Her daughter Catherine died when she was just a day old. That sense of loss trickled into her stories as they won over readers and literary prizes year after year.
Gift of knowledge, the most priceless gift you can give your children.
Munro's stories also inspired dozens of film and TV adaptations, including Sarah Polley's Oscar-nominated Away From Her.
We've had a good life together. Those are your words, Fiona, not mine. That is not your sweater.
The biggest prize in Munro's life came in October 2013. At age 82, she became the first Canadian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. She responded to the honor in her classic self-deprecating style.
This is what you work towards. And so you wouldn't be so ungracious as to say, "Oh, it's all a terrible nuisance," would you?
Munro's win was celebrated around the country, and the sales of her story collections skyrocketed. It was the crown jewel in the career of the woman who, in telling private, intimate tales, ignited the imagination of the world. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, we'd love to hear from you. How did Alice Munro's writing impact you? And what does her writing mean to you? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can email bctoday@cbc.ca. Now, Alice lived in West Vancouver in the 1950s with her husband James at the time and their young daughters until they moved to Victoria in 1963, where they opened Munro's Books. She also had a home in Comox with her second husband, the late Gerald Fremlin. Now, we've reached Justina Elias at Munro's Books in Victoria. Justina is the head of fiction and an award-winning author herself. Hello, Justina.
Hi.
Hi, it's very nice to speak with you. You have the Munro's Books sign behind you there. I think it's one of those places, when I've been in there, I just feel not the presence, but the legacy of Alice Munro. What does today mean for you? What are you reflecting about?
Oh, it's a big day. I mean, I read my first Alice Munro story when I was 19 in university. I was an aspiring writer myself. I still am. And it was years later when I would move to the West Coast and get a job here. And I knew nothing about the lore of the store when I started here. I had only just moved to Victoria. And when I found out that it was Munro's Books, as in that Munro, Alice Munro, I was just absolutely blown away. And the honor of walking past, we have a little sign in the Canadian fiction section, just noting where all of her books are. And there's a little image of her on the sign. Walking past that day in, day out, it's a remarkable thing. I mean, I feel just incredibly honored and lucky to work here and to continue selling her books to people from around the world who come clamoring for them.
And are they clamoring today? Have you been hearing from people calling or coming in? Yeah.
Oh, the phones have been ringing off the hook. I mean, her Nobel win predated my time at the store by a couple of years, but it's part of the store's lore, just the scrambling that people were doing to put together displays to keep up with demand. There were media camped outside the store in the morning.
Oh.
It's a big day. And, today is a sad day, but it's also just a remarkable day to reflect on everything she's meant to so many people, so many readers and writers.
What is it that made her so special to readers and writers who have been influenced by her?
Well, she's such an interesting person to try to describe to someone who doesn't know very much about her work, because when it comes to the content of her stories, there's really nothing flashy about it. She worked with a pretty limited range of themes and places and characters. And yet she does so much with so little in terms of word count on the page. I studied her many times in school. And one of the things you really focus on when you're writing short fiction is how you manage time. Because in a novel, you have time. You have time to write what people talk about as the connective tissue. You can sort of connect the dots.
Yeah.
You can explain things for your reader. But in a short story, you don't have that luxury. And so every sentence really has to count. And I know there's a famous anecdote from Deborah Treisman. She's the editor over at The New Yorker, which published many of Munro's stories over the years. But she talks about editing a Munro story. And she said, you'll be on page 3 and you'll find a parenthetical aside and you'll think, oh, okay, we're going to cut the fat. We don't really need that. And she would slash it out. And lo and behold, 20 pages later, every time it would turn out that what seemed like a flippant comment early in the story was actually something pivotal, and you'd have to put it back in.
That's right.
You know, no one does it like Munro. We all try to emulate her, and we all fail terribly. But it's a wonderful thing to try.
It's so true. You know, like when I studied short stories in university, I loved short stories for that efficiency and how much you get out of every line. And she just emulated that to the nth degree. And you're so right. Even within the setting of small rural Canada, you know, small rural towns, the bigness of the characters and you know the size of the characters and their dreams and their hopes just seem to outsize the short story itself, the page count and the word count.
Yeah. And, you know, just the depth of her vision and of her understanding of human nature, her absolutely ruthless sensibility. There is not a sentimental line in any Munro story. And yet, of course, they're full of heart and feeling. You know, she was a mother herself, and you get the sense of genuine emotion and feeling between the characters, but she's not trying to sugarcoat anything for anyone. She's getting at some very deep core truths about what it is to be human.
It's kind of how she carried herself too, isn't it? That sort
It
of
is.
wry wit.
Exactly.
Let's put the numbers out there once again. We're asking you, you know, today a giant of Canadian literature has died. Alice Munro, the celebrated short story writer. Many of her stories have been turned into films, including an Oscar-nominated film by Sarah Polley, Away from Her. And so we're asking you, you know, what is her influence? What has Alice Munro's writing meant to you? The readers out there, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And my guest is author Justina Elias, who is the head of fiction at the venerable Munro's Books in Victoria. I have this these memories of my trips there. And can I ask you as well about her portrayal of women? You know, how special and how meaningful was that?
Oh, certainly. I mean, you know, as you'd mentioned, she was a mother of 3. She was writing her first stories when her girls were very young, and she didn't have the luxury of waiting for inspiration to strike and just sort of waiting for the muse, as many male writers might have been able to. You know, she had stuff to do. She had to work at the store. She had to take care of the girls. But at the same time, she just had this undying passion for writing and for expressing herself. And, you know, she grew up in a time when girls are supposed to be seen and not heard. And she absolutely refused to bow to that demand. And, you know, she was condescended to a lot when she was young, you know, and I remember I used to work at a used bookstore, and one time we got a copy of Lives of Girls and Women in, and it had a particularly flowery cover, and my coworker, who didn't really know much about Munro, had mistakenly filed her in, you know, I think we actually called it the chick lit fiction, unbelievably, back then. And there was this idea that there's something inherently frivolous about women's writing. But of course there isn't. Women have just as much access to the universal human experience as men. And Munro knew that. And she wrote about men with great affection, but also with that same ruthlessness. You know, she was not unaware of the pressures that women, especially women who are mothers, faced that men simply did not.
Yes. You know, when you talk about her turning to writing, and in fact, it was because she was a mother with 3 young daughters. She said she didn't have time to devote to writing a whole novel. She thought she'd write short stories for a while. But yes, she knew at the age of 14 that she wanted to be a writer. But as you know, you touched on here, Justina, back then you didn't go around announcing something like that. You didn't call attention. Maybe it was being Canadian, maybe it was being a woman, maybe both.
Yeah, it's funny to envision that literary landscape because, of course, the name of the game now is self-promotion. And you need to be good at really singing your own praises all the time. And I can't think of anything that a young Alice Munro would have balked at more, and an older Alice Munro for that matter. I mean, she was not a not a conceited person, even though she had every right to be. And partly that was her upbringing, of course, and gender norms, but also that was just her inherent grace, I think.
Yeah. What was her connection to Munro's books in recent years?
She was less connected with the store in recent years. But, she was pivotal to the founding of the store, and the store itself has a certain meaning in Victoria. So she was one of the original founders in 1963 at our Yates Street location. We're currently on Government Street in an historic bank building, but by the time we'd moved here in 1984, she was no longer directly involved with the store. But she and James Munro, had a vision for the store, and they wanted to carry the weird stuff, the avant-garde stuff, the literary stuff that you just really couldn't find in other stores at the time. And that vision, I think, has continued to this day. Like, it's a wonderful thing to work in an independent bookstore where we as booksellers have autonomy over what we're bringing in. And we get to champion undersung books, and even the form itself of the short story. It's so wonderful to be in a place where the best-selling writer in the store always was someone famous for short stories, which are such an underdog as a form.
I love
It's
it.
a joke in the publishing industry. It's so hard to sell short stories, right? But not here.
That underdog, right? And again, being a woman, writing at the time that she did, there were so many these kind of restrictions on what you could say or do. And so does that resonate now? As you say, even now it feels like, yes, the short story in this independent bookstore, does that feeling of writing as the underdog, being the underdog resonate, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's a joke among booksellers and those in the publishing industry that if a publisher can get away with calling something a novel, they will, even if
it's
anyone
a novella.
who looked at it for any length of time. Yes, exactly. Get that word in there somewhere. Even the name of our fiction section, the sign says novels, because that's what most people are looking for. But and then when you look at Lives of Girls and Women, for example, which is often described as being Munro's only novel, well, really, it's a collection of interrelated short stories. And in fact, that's known as being a particularly Canadian form. And so I think it's quite appropriate that, Canadians tend to consider themselves underdogs compared to the States as well. When she won the Nobel, she was the first Canadian, I think, to win the Nobel in literature, and she was a woman, and it was for short stories. It's a trifecta of being an underdog. It was just so thrilling.
Yes, the trifecta. What's happening at the bookstore? I know you're getting flooded with calls and visits. What is a day like? Are you a buzz?
We are a buzz. And in fact, normally Jessica Walker, the store owner, would have been the one doing this interview, for example, but she has been run off her feet doing media all morning, bless her. And so I stepped up for this, but the phones have been ringing off the hook. We've posted our tribute to Alice on our social media. Instantly, hundreds of comments, hundreds of shares. I mean, the outpouring of love is it's a beautiful thing. What a legacy. What a place to and a collection of work to leave behind.
And for yourself as a writer in Victoria, what do you take from her legacy?
I admire her commitment to a form that remains to this day an underdog. There is immense pressure. A lot of writers these days will have their first book come out and it's a novel. And then very often what happens is a short story collection will follow. And almost always those stories were written before the novel, but no publisher would dare to take the chance on it before they'd made their name with the novel. And so, there's been that professional pressure for a long time to write what is marketable.
Right.
It's funny because you would think in this day and age, a shorter word count would mean that it would cater to people's shorter attention spans, but it requires a depth of attention that a novel might not necessarily. And so I find that very inspiring, the fact that she thought it was worth it. And I also just loved the subject she chose. Again, there's nothing flashy about a Munro plot. In her later works, there were more in the way of sort of surprising deaths and things, but she was not writing sensational stories if you were just to, write the synopsis of the plot. It was really about the interior lives of her characters. And she was, it's a cliche in book reviews to call someone unflinching, but I really think that is a fair word to use for her approach. And she just dared to say the things that a lot of people wouldn't.
It's a day, I think, where we can turn to cliches. You're right, a sad one, but a meaningful one today. Thank you so much for reflecting on Alice Munro with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Justina Elias is published in Prairie Fire magazine, Room, The Puritan, and elsewhere. She won the Malahat Review's 2021 Creative Nonfiction Prize and has twice been longlisted for the CBC Short Story Prize. This is BC Today, and earlier in the show we talked about wildfires and what your community needs in order to prepare for wildfire. Michael writes from Nelson, each community is surrounded by private residences with acreage. Crown land in many towns have already been fire-smarted by contractors, yet private acreages have not had support, except only for residents fire-smarting through Fire Smart assessment and rebates on work done. $10,000 a hectare is the usual cost for acreage fire-smarting. Some sort of tax rebate, contractor support, or no-interest loans are necessary for this private land to be fire-smarted. It would properly act as a buffer to prevent fires from entering cities, as well as reducing residents' lost. Frank writes, I'm glad someone said it. Keep everyone out of the bush now. No admittance, not even loggers. 24/7 drones to watch for any spot fires. Crews dropped in Rapattack style. Dirt, soil, rocks, and water should be dropped on fires by heavy lifting helicopters. And arson is a criminal offense. Thank you very much for that email as well. And we also have another email here. Scott actually wrote us back from the Sunshine Coast saying, we had another problem in 1917. The forest firefighters pulled water from our hydrants to fill the tanker trucks and reduced our community water supply substantially. We have no snowpack left this year. Normally, we'd have about 14 feet of snow up there. How do we get the firefighters to pump from local lakes and inlets instead of using the community water supply for forest fires? Thanks so much for writing us back as well from the Sunshine Coast. Our email address, bctoday@cbc.ca. And a reminder, of course, the Canucks versus the Oilers, Game 4, live on CBC television tonight.